I'd like everyone to meet Sophia, my partner in every sense of the word, Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the chatter of our annual family reunion. His arm draped possessively around a willowy brunette who couldn't be more than 30. She understands what it takes to build something meaningful, he added, his gaze locking with mine across my grandmother's antique dining table. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of ice clinking in someone's glass. Little did Marcus know that in exactly 17 minutes, I would be announcing my acquisition of TriCore Industries, the very company he'd sacrificed our marriage to climb the ranks of, and where he'd just been passed over for CEO in favor of me, his soon-to-be ex-wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I first met Marcus Winters at Northwestern's MBA program 15 years ago. We were both ambitious, both determined to make our mark in the corporate world, though our approaches couldn't have been more different. Marcus was all charisma and bold moves, commanding attention in every room. I preferred careful analysis and strategic patience, building relationships and understanding systems before making my move. "You analyze too much, Olivia," he'd tell me during late-night study sessions. "Sometimes you need to be the first person to throw your hat in the ring." I admired his confidence, the way he could convince anyone of anything with just his voice and presence. He seemed to admire my thoroughness, my ability to find the flaws in any business plan and strengthen them. We married 2 years after graduation, just as Marcus landed his dream job at TriCore Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company with significant growth potential in the sustainable energy sector. I took a position at Wellington Capital, a private equity firm that specialized in strategic acquisitions. We bought our first home in the suburbs of Chicago, hosted dinner parties for colleagues, and planned our ascent up the corporate ladder with the same detail we planned our European vacations. The first 5 years were everything we'd imagined in our late-night conversations in business school. Marcus moved up quickly at TriCore, becoming the youngest division head in the company's history. I built a reputation at Wellington for identifying undervalued companies with solid fundamentals and turning them into profitable investments. We were equals, partners in a life we were building together. Or so I thought. The shift was subtle at first. As Marcus reached the upper echelons of TriCore's management, he began undermining my accomplishments in small ways. When I closed a major acquisition deal, he'd comment that I'd gotten lucky with the timing. When I received a promotion, he suggested it was because Wellington needed more women in leadership positions. Each comment came wrapped in a smile, often delivered in social settings where challenging him would have seemed petty. "Marcus, why did you say that?" I asked after a dinner party where he'd joked that my latest success was impressive for someone who overthinks everything. "Say what?" he replied, loosening his tie as we prepared for bed. "That thing about overthinking? Come on, Liv. Everyone knows that's your thing. I was just teasing." It felt dismissive. He sighed. The sound weighted with exaggerated patience. "You're being too sensitive. I'm your biggest cheerleader, you know that." By our 8th anniversary, the distance between us had grown from a crack to a chasm. Marcus was rarely home, consumed by his quest to become TriCore's next CEO. The current chief executive, Gerald Harmon, was set to retire within 2 years, and Marcus had positioned himself as the obvious successor. I, too, had thrown myself into my work, finding satisfaction in the complex deals I structured and the respect I'd earned in an industry still dominated by men. We were living parallel lives rather than shared ones, coming together for social appearances but rarely connecting beneath the surface. It was during this period that I first considered taking control of my circumstances in a way Marcus would never anticipate. Wellington had been exploring investment opportunities in the renewable energy sector, and TriCore had appeared on our radar as a potentially undervalued asset with new technology patents that weren't being fully leveraged. During a preliminary research meeting, I excused myself, citing a conflict of interest due to my husband's position. Later that evening, my colleague Diane called me at home. "Olivia, I wanted to give you a heads up about something," she said, her voice deliberately casual. "I was having drinks with Emily from Hudson Partners, and she mentioned they're preparing a bid for TriCore." I sat up straighter. TriCore isn't publicly announcing acquisition discussions. Exactly. This is strictly back-channel information. Apparently, Gerald Harmon isn't as confident in his executive team as everyone thinks. He's quietly exploring options that would allow him to cash out before retirement. The information rattled me, not just professionally but personally. If TriCore was acquired, Marcus's path to CEO would likely disappear. He'd built his entire identity around that goal. "Thanks for letting me know," I told Diane, my mind already racing with implications. "There's one more thing," she hesitated. "Emily mentioned that TriCore's senior leadership has some unusual interpersonal dynamics affecting succession planning. Specifically, there's concern about your husband's relationship with their new marketing director." I didn't press for details, but I thought you should know. The confirmation of what I'd suspected for months hit with surprising force. Marcus had mentioned Sophia Chen repeatedly over the past year, first as a brilliant new hire, then as a valued team member, and finally as someone who really gets my vision for TriCore. I'd noticed the changes in his behavior, the late-night strategy sessions, the weekend conferences they both attended, the way he guarded his phone. But hearing it acknowledged as corporate gossip made it suddenly, painfully real. That night, as Marcus once again worked late, I made two decisions that would ultimately change everything. First, I would investigate what was really happening at TriCore, both financially and personally. Second, I would protect myself by creating an investment vehicle separate from our joint accounts, something I should have done years ago. The next morning, I called an old business school friend who had since moved into private banking. "Rachel, I need to set up a personal investment corporation, completely separate from my existing finances. Can we meet today?" Within a week, Winterfall Investments was established with me as the sole shareholder. I transferred a significant portion of my personal savings and stock options into this new entity. Marcus and I had maintained separate accounts alongside our joint ones, a decision he'd initially resisted, but that I'd insisted on. "We're both financial professionals," I'd argued. "It just makes sense to maintain some independence." He'd eventually agreed, perhaps already planning his own exit strategy. What followed was 3 months of careful investigation. I took a partial leave of absence from Wellington, citing family reasons, which wasn't entirely untrue. Using industry, contacts, and paying for discreet professional analysis, I built a comprehensive understanding of TriCore's actual financial position. What I discovered was fascinating. The company was significantly undervalued, primarily because Gerald Harmon had been deliberately conservative in market projections to manage shareholder expectations while investing heavily in R&D that didn't yet appear on the balance sheet. Simultaneously, I hired a private investigator to document Marcus's relationship with Sophia Chen. The evidence was as comprehensive as it was heartbreaking. dinner dates in neighboring towns, weekend getaways, disguised as business trips and intimate moments captured at her downtown apartment. The marriage I'd once valued had become nothing more than a convenient fiction for Marcus, a respectable backdrop for his corporate ambitions. Rather than confronting him immediately, I developed a strategy. Through Winterfall Investments, I quietly began acquiring shares in TriCore whenever they became available. The company wasn't actively traded, but with patience and premium offers to existing shareholders, I gradually built a significant minority position. More importantly, I arranged meetings with several key institutional investors who collectively controlled nearly 30% of TriCore's stock. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The company's true value isn't reflected in the current leadership's conservative approach, I explained during these meetings, never mentioning my connection to Marcus. With the right strategic vision and more aggressive market positioning, TriCore could double its valuation within 3 years. By the time Gerald Harmon learned of my activities, I had secured enough support to present a credible acquisition offer through a consortium led by Winterfall Investments. Gerald, recognizing the potential for a messy public battle that could devalue his own substantial holdings, agreed to meet. "You're Marcus Winter's wife," he stated flatly when I walked into his office. "I am," I acknowledged, "though I'm here strictly in my capacity as the managing director of Winterfall Investments." Gerald studied me with new interest. "Does Marcus know about this?" "No, and I'd appreciate your discretion until our discussions reach a natural conclusion." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Interesting. Marcus has been quite vocal about his qualifications to lead TriCore after my retirement. He seems to believe the position is already his." "And what do you believe, Mr. Harmon?" Gerald leaned back in his chair. "I believe TriCore needs leadership that values substance over appearance, strategic patience over impulsive action. I've built this company over 25 years, Ms. Winters. I won't hand it to someone who views it merely as a stepping stone to greater personal glory." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, discussing TriCore's technology, market position, and untapped potential. I shared my vision for transitioning more aggressively into renewable energy storage solutions, leveraging patents the company had secured but not fully developed. As our meeting concluded, Gerald made an unexpected proposal. "I've been considering alternatives to a standard acquisition. What would you think about a structured transition? Winterfall and your investor consortium purchase a controlling interest, I retain a significant minority position and board seat, and you step in as CEO to implement your vision." "Me?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "You have the financial background, strategic vision, and investor backing. More importantly, you clearly care about what happens to this company beyond your own advancement." He paused. "And I admit I'm curious to see Marcus's reaction when he learns who his new boss will be." The negotiation process took another 2 months of intense work. Throughout this period, Marcus grew increasingly distant, frequently traveling for critical client meetings that my investigator confirmed were rendezvous with Sophia. When he was home, he talked incessantly about his imminent promotion to CEO, criticizing Gerald's leadership and outlining all the changes he would implement. "Gerald just doesn't understand modern corporate strategy," he complained one evening. "He's stuck in the past. TriCore needs someone who can take bold action." I nodded, sipping my wine. "When do you expect the announcement?" "The board meets Next month. Gerald's been doing final interviews, but it's basically a formality at this point. He checked his phone, smiling slightly at whatever message had arrived. I need to respond to this. Work never stops when you're next in line. I watched him type rapidly, wondering if he was messaging Sophia or actually handling work matters. Perhaps at this point they were one and the same for him. The final agreement was signed 3 days before our annual family reunion, traditionally held at my grandmother's estate outside Chicago. The timing wasn't coincidental. I deliberately scheduled the closing to align with this gathering of our extended families, many of whom had witnessed our relationship from its hopeful beginning to what would now be its very public end. Marcus had seemed unusually energized about attending the reunion this year, insisting we arrive early to help with preparations. This was out of character for him, as he typically treated family gatherings as obligations rather than pleasures. Now I understood why. The morning of the reunion dawned bright and clear. As we drove separately to my grandmother's estate, Marcus claiming an early meeting would delay him, I received the final confirmation. The acquisition had cleared all regulatory hurdles. I was now effectively the CEO of TriCore Industries, though the public announcement wouldn't come until Monday morning. Guests began arriving around noon, filling my grandmother's sprawling Victorian home with the comfortable chaos of family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends mingled on the wide porch and manicured lawn, catching up on a year's worth of news. I moved among them with practiced ease, deflecting questions about Marcus's absence with vague references to work, commitments. At 3 o'clock, just as everyone was gathering for the traditional family photo, Marcus finally arrived. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him, looking slightly nervous but determined, was Sophia Chen. I recognized her immediately from the investigators' photographs, though seeing her in person, young, beautiful, and clutching Marcus's arm, sent a jolt through me that I hadn't anticipated. My cousin Emma spotted them first, her eyebrows rising as she glanced between them and me. "Olivia," she murmured. "Who is that with Marcus?" "I believe we're about to find out," I replied, surprising myself with how calm I felt. Marcus guided Sophia through the crowd, smiling and nodding at family members but making no introductions until they reached the center of the gathering. Then, with a deliberate tap on a nearby glass to gain everyone's attention, he made his announcement. "I'd like everyone to meet Sophia, my partner in every sense of the word," he declared, voice projecting to reach even those at the edges of the gathering. "She understands what it takes to build something meaningful." The silence that followed was complete. My grandmother, seated in her favorite chair on the porch, looked from Marcus to me with an expression of dawning outrage. My father half rose from his seat, only to be restrained by my mother's hand on his arm. "Marcus," my Uncle Thomas finally said, "what exactly are you saying?" Marcus straightened, squaring his shoulders. "I'm saying that Olivia and I have grown apart over the years. We want different things. Sophia and I have formed a connection. That's both personal and professional. She's been instrumental in helping me position myself for the CEO role at TriCore." More silence. All eyes turned to me, waiting for tears, accusations, or a dramatic exit. Instead, I smiled slightly and checked my watch. "Is that the announcement you wanted to make?" I asked, my voice steady. Marcus frowned, clearly thrown by my lack of visible distress. "Yes, I thought it was time everyone knew the truth." "Excellent timing," I replied, "because I also have an announcement, and it concerns TriCore as well." Confusion flickered across his face. "What are you talking about?" I moved to stand beside my grandmother, drawing strength from her presence as I had throughout my childhood. As of 3 days ago, Winterfall Investments, in partnership with a consortium of strategic investors, has acquired controlling interest in TriCore Industries. Gerald Harmon will remain on the board, but effective Monday morning, I will be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer. The color drained from Marcus's face. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible, it's completed," I countered, pulling my phone from my pocket and displaying the confirmation email from our attorneys. The board voted unanimously. Gerald was particularly supportive. Sophia's hand dropped from Marcus's arm as she stared at me with widening eyes. "You're taking over TriCore?" But Marcus said, "I imagine Marcus has said many things," I interrupted gently. "Just as he told our family you're his partner while still being legally married to me. At least until the divorce papers I filed yesterday are processed." The gathering erupted into chaos then. Exclamations, questions, and my father's barely restrained fury directed at Marcus. Through it all, I maintained my composure, watching as Marcus's confident facade crumbled under the weight of reality. "You did this deliberately," he hissed when he finally managed to reach me. "You knew about the CEO position and deliberately undermined me." "No, Marcus. I identified an undervalued company with excellent growth potential and made a strategic acquisition. The fact that you work there and have been having an affair with a colleague while undermining my career for years simply made the victory more satisfying." He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps he was. "How long have you been planning this? How long have you been sleeping with Sophia while telling me you were working late?" I countered. Something like shame flickered across his face before hardening into anger. "This isn't over." "Actually, it is," I replied quietly. "Your personal belongings have been packed and delivered to Sophia's apartment. The locks on our house have been changed. And on Monday morning, you'll need to decide if you can work for the wife you betrayed or if you'd prefer to tender your resignation." Marcus turned without another word, grabbing Sophia's hand and practically dragging her toward the exit. The silence that followed their departure was broken by my grandmother's voice, strong despite her 86 years. "Well," she announced to the stunned gathering, "I believe this calls for champagne. Thomas, be a dear and bring up the good bottles from the cellar. My granddaughter has just become a CEO." As the initial shock subsided, family members surrounded me with questions, congratulations, and expressions of support. My cousin Emma hugged me tightly. "How are you really doing?" she whispered. "Processing," I admitted. "It's been an intense few months." "I can't believe you kept this quiet while orchestrating a corporate takeover." I smiled slightly. Marcus always underestimated me. He thought because I'm methodical and patient that I lacked ambition or courage. He never understood that I was playing a longer game. As twilight settled over my grandmother's estate, I found a quiet moment to slip away to the old wooden swing overlooking the property's small lake. The same swing where, years ago, Marcus had first told me he loved me during another family gathering. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Mind if I join?" "You?" My father's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Please," I said, moving over to make room. He sat beside me, and for a few minutes, we simply swung in companionable silence, watching fireflies begin to emerge over the water. "You know," he finally said, When you were little, your mother and I worried that you were too trusting. You always wanted to see the best in people. I smiled at the memory. You told me that trust wasn't a weakness as long as I also trusted myself. And look at you now. Pride colored his voice. Running. A company standing your ground. I'm sorry it came with personal pain. The marriage was over long before today, I admitted. I just needed to find my way forward on my terms, not his. My father nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Your grandmother hasn't stopped telling everyone her granddaughter is a CEO. I think she's already planning to redecorate her guest room for when you visit to escape corporate pressures. The thought made me laugh, releasing tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I might take her up on that. The next few months will be challenging. Because of Marcus? Partly, but mostly because transforming TriCore will take work. The company has potential it hasn't begun to realize. My father studied me in the fading light. You're excited about this, aren't you? Beyond the satisfaction of outmaneuvering Marcus, I considered his question seriously. Yes. For the first time in years, I'm building something that's entirely mine, not defined by or in reaction to him. It feels clarifying. As we walked back to join the others, I realized that despite the public humiliation Marcus had intended to inflict, I felt strangely liberated. The careful calculation and strategic patience that he had dismissed as weaknesses had become my greatest strengths. I had taken back the narrative he tried to control and rewritten it on my own terms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a company to lead, a divorce to finalize, a life to rebuild. But tonight, surrounded by family who saw and valued me for exactly who I was, I allowed myself to celebrate not just a corporate victory, but a personal one. I had stopped diminishing myself to accommodate someone else's ego, and finally stepped fully into my own power. And that, perhaps, was the most satisfying acquisition of all. The minutes after Marcus stormed out of my grandmother's estate with Sophia in tow stretched into a surreal blur of congratulations and questions. Family members gathered around me in protective clusters, offering everything from legal advice to promises of physical retribution against Marcus. My Uncle Thomas, a retired judge, was particularly vocal about ensuring I had bulletproof representation for the divorce proceedings. I know 3 attorneys who would consider it an honor to destroy him in court, he declared, champagne sloshing dangerously in his glass as he made sweeping gestures. Men like Marcus believe they're untouchable, until they're not. My grandmother, ever the family matriarch, eventually called for order by tapping her cane against the hardwood floor, a sound that had commanded attention across 5 decades of family gatherings. Enough legal talk, she announced. Olivia has clearly demonstrated she can handle her affairs without a committee. She turned to me, her eyes sharp despite her years. Though I do expect a full accounting of how you managed to acquire a company right under that fool's nose without him suspecting a thing. This drew appreciative laughter, breaking the tension that had lingered since Marcus's dramatic exit. As conversations gradually returned to normal family reunion topics, I slipped away to my grandmother's study, a book-lined sanctuary where I'd spent countless hours during childhood summers. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and lemon polish offered comfort as I checked the flood of emails and messages that had accumulated on my phone. Diane from Wellington had sent 3 increasingly urgent texts. Is it true? The TriCore acquisition was you? The financial press has somehow caught wind of Monday's announcement. Call me ASAP. This is going to break wide open by morning. I sighed. realizing the timeline for my public transition had just accelerated dramatically. A quick check of industry. News sites confirmed Diane's warning. Somehow, word had leaked about the change in TriCore's leadership. Speculation was running rampant, with my name already appearing in several articles alongside Marcus's. "I thought I might find you hiding in here," my mother said, closing the study door behind her as she entered. She placed a fresh glass of champagne on the desk before me. "You always retreated to books when things got overwhelming." I smiled. Gratefully. Some habits never change. She settled into the leather chair opposite mine, studying me with the intense focus that had always made me feel simultaneously seen and scrutinized. "Are you really all right, Olivia?" "I'm processing," I admitted. "This isn't exactly how I planned for everything to unfold." "I imagine not. Corporate takeovers generally don't coincide with public marital implosions at family gatherings." Despite everything, I laughed. My mother had always had a gift for stating uncomfortable truths in ways that somehow made them manageable. "How long have you known about Marcus and this woman?" she asked. "Suspected for over a year, confirmed it 3 months ago." I traced the rim of my champagne glass. "But the problem started long before Sophia entered the picture. Marcus stopped seeing me as an equal years ago." My mother nodded, unsurprised. "I noticed the way he spoke about your work had changed. Always with that hint of condescension, as if your successes were cute coincidences rather than the result of your abilities. You never said anything." "Would you have listened?" she asked gently. "You were working so hard to maintain the image of your perfect partnership. Pointing out its flaws seemed counterproductive." She was right, of course. I had invested so much in the narrative of our power couple dynamic that acknowledging its fundamental imbalance would have required a complete reassessment of not just my marriage, but my identity within it. I should have confronted him earlier, I acknowledged. Instead, I channeled everything into work and this acquisition. "And built yourself an exit strategy in the process," my mother observed. "That seems entirely appropriate given the circumstances." We sat in companionable silence for a moment before she spoke again. "Your father wants to disown him, you know. He's been updating his will in the other room." I couldn't help but smile at the image. "Tell him that's unnecessary. I think becoming Marcus's boss is punishment enough." My mother's eyebrows rose. Slightly. "So you're actually keeping him at TriCore?" "That depends entirely on him," I replied. "If he can adapt to the new reality and contribute value to the company, I have no personal objection to his continued employment. Business and personal are separate considerations." "Very magnanimous," she said, though her tone suggested she found my approach perhaps too generous. "And if he can't adapt?" "Then he'll be managed out like any other underperforming executive." I took a sip of champagne. Either way, the power dynamic he cultivated so carefully has been permanently altered. My mother studied me with new appreciation. "You know, when you were little, your father and I worried that your quiet nature might be a disadvantage in the corporate world. Clearly, we underestimated the advantage of being underestimated." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Gerald Harmon. I excused myself to take it, stepping out onto the small private balcony attached to the study. "Gerald," I answered, "I was planning to call you tomorrow. I thought you should know that Marcus has been trying to reach me for the past hour," he said without preamble. "Apparently your announcement caused quite a scene." "You could say that," I agreed. "How much does he know?" "Only what you told him, presumably." He's demanding an emergency board meeting, claiming there must have been some mistake or manipulation involved in the acquisition. I sighed. That sounds like Marcus. Indeed. I've scheduled the meeting for Monday morning before the public. Announcement. I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to address the board personally before the news breaks widely. Thank you, Gerald. That's helpful. There was a brief pause before he continued, his voice taking on a different quality. Olivia, I should mention that several board members have expressed concern about the personal complications of this transition. They're worried about the optics. You mean they're worried about a messy public divorce between the new CEO and a senior executive? I translated. Precisely. Corporate governance gets tricky in these situations. I assured them you would handle it with appropriate professionalism, but you should be prepared for some pointed questions. After ending the call, I leaned against the balcony railing, watching distant car headlights move along the country roads surrounding my grandmother's property. The sunset painted the sky in dramatic oranges and purples, a fitting backdrop for a day of dramatic revelations. The sound of the balcony door opening behind me announced my cousin Emma's arrival. She handed me a plate of food. Aunt Margaret was concerned you hadn't eaten. Also, I think she wanted me to conduct a wellness check since you've been hiding out here for over an hour. Just handling some unexpected developments, I explained, gratefully accepting the plate. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until that moment. Emma settled beside me, her shoulder lightly bumping mine in the familiar gesture of solidarity we'd shared since childhood. So, she said, drawing out the word, CEO of TriCore Industries. That's quite the revenge plot. It wasn't about revenge, I corrected. At least not entirely. TriCore is genuinely undervalued with significant growth potential in renewable energy storage. The acquisition made business sense regardless of Marcus's involvement. Emma gave me a skeptical look. But the timing of your announcement wasn't coincidental. I smiled slightly. No, that part was definitely deliberate. I still can't believe he brought her here, Emma said, shaking her head. To a family gathering. What did he think would happen? He thought I would collapse, I replied simply. Fall apart publicly, create a scene, and confirm his narrative that I'm too emotional and unsuited for high-stakes leadership. It's the same strategy he's used for years, putting me in situations where I'm at a disadvantage, then watching me struggle while offering helpful criticism. And instead, you revealed you've bought his company. Emma grinned. I wish I'd recorded his face. It was like watching someone get hit with a truck they didn't see coming. Despite the violent metaphor, I laughed. It wasn't my original plan to announce it this way. The formal press release is scheduled for Monday morning, but when he created this particular moment, you seized the opportunity, Emma finished. Rightly so. We stood in companionable silence for a moment before Emma spoke again. What happens now, with TriCore and with Marcus? It was the question I'd been asking myself since the acquisition had first become a possibility. The professional aspects were straightforward enough. TriCore needed strategic repositioning, aggressive investment in its renewable technology patents, and streamlined operations. The personal complications were far messier. Professionally, I focus on transforming TriCore into the industry leader it should be, I said. As for Marcus, that's largely up to him. If he can adapt to the new reality and contribute value, there's no business reason to remove him. Emma looked skeptical. You'd actually keep working with him after what he did? Business and personal are separate considerations. I repeated my earlier statement, though even to my own ears it sounded more like a mantra than a conviction. And if personal considerations make that impossible? I considered the question seriously. Then he'll need to find another position elsewhere, but that would be his choice, not mine. Emma studied me for a moment. You really mean that? Don't you? This isn't just about humiliating him or exercising power. You'd genuinely work with him if he could handle it. The company is what matters now, I replied. TriCore employs over 800 people. Their livelihoods depend on leadership making decisions based on business outcomes, not personal vendettas. Always the pragmatist, Emma said, though her tone was admiring rather than critical. Though I have to admit, watching Marcus forced to report to you after the way he's treated you would be a certain kind of justice. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of family conversations, well-wishers, and increasingly tipsy relatives offering advice on everything from corporate strategy to how best to make Marcus suffer. This last suggestion coming from my normally mild-mannered Aunt Camille after her fourth glass of wine. By the time I departed for the hotel where I'd booked a room, returning to the house I'd shared with Marcus seemed unwise given the day's events. I was emotionally exhausted, but strangely clear-headed. The hotel suite offered blessed quiet after the chaos of the day. I kicked off my shoes and poured myself a glass of water, settling on the couch with my laptop to review the final press materials for Monday's announcement. My phone buzzed with yet another message, this one from a number I didn't immediately recognize. This is Sophia Chen. We need to talk, please. I stared at the message, momentarily taken aback by her audacity. After several minutes of deliberation, I replied, "There's nothing to discuss. Any communication regarding TriCore should go through proper channels after Monday's announcement." Her response came immediately. "This isn't about TriCore. Marcus isn't who I thought he was. He lied to me about many things, including the status of your marriage and his position at the company." I felt a flicker of unwanted sympathy. Sophia wasn't the first woman to be deceived by Marcus's confident assertions and selective truths. Still, she had knowingly engaged in a relationship with a married man, one who happened to be her superior at work. My sympathy had distinct limits. "That's unfortunate, but not my concern," I replied. "I suggest you reconsider your personal and professional associations." I put my phone on silent after that, unwilling to be drawn further into what was clearly a rapidly deteriorating situation between Marcus and his upgrade. Instead, I focused on finalizing my remarks for Monday's board meeting and subsequent press conference, crafting language that acknowledged the unusual circumstances without dwelling on the personal drama. At some point near midnight, exhaustion finally overtook me. I fell into a dreamless sleep, waking early the next morning to sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains I'd forgotten to close. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't remember why I was in a hotel rather than at home. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. I reached for my phone, unsurprised to find it filled with notifications. What did surprise me was the nature of those notifications. Dozens of congratulatory messages from industry contacts, former classmates and colleagues, many referencing news articles that had apparently been published overnight. The most prominent, from the Wall Street Journal, bore the headline, "Wellington Capital Director Orchestrates Stealth Acquisition of Husband's Company." The Chicago Tribune had taken a more sensational approach. Corporate power couple implodes as wife acquires husband's firm in surprise takeover. Scrolling through the articles, I found most of the reporting reasonably accurate, if somewhat dramatic in tone. Financial analysts were already speculating about TriCore's future direction under my leadership, with several noting my track record at Wellington for identifying and developing undervalued assets. More concerning were the inevitable references to the personal aspects of the situation. Several articles mentioned Sophia Chen by name, citing sources close to the company, who confirmed an inappropriate relationship between her and Marcus. I could only imagine Marcus's reaction to seeing his personal indiscretions splashed across the business press. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang with Marcus's number. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Olivia." His voice was tightly controlled, vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "What the hell have you done?" "Good morning, Marcus," I replied calmly. "I assume you're referring to the press coverage?" "You know damn well I am. You leaked this, didn't you? Made sure everyone knew about Sophia and me before the official announcement?" "No," I said simply. I had planned a controlled release of information tomorrow morning. Someone else clearly had different ideas. There was a brief silence as he processed this. "You expect me to believe that? Your belief is irrelevant. It's the truth." I paused. "How's Sophia handling the attention?" His bitter laugh told me everything I needed to know. "She's threatening to sue for emotional distress and damage to her professional reputation. Says I misrepresented everything and put her in an impossible position." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Sophia was likely experiencing her first taste of Marcus's capacity for self-preservation at others' expense. "That sounds challenging," I said neutrally, though perhaps instructive about the consequences of certain choices. "Don't you dare lecture me," he snapped. "You've orchestrated this entire situation, buying TriCore behind my back, humiliating me in front of our families, and now making sure everyone in the industry knows I've been cuckolded by my own wife." The unfairness of his characterization was so breathtaking that for a moment I couldn't formulate a response. When I did find my voice, it was colder than I'd intended. "Let me be absolutely clear, Marcus. I purchased an undervalued company with excellent growth potential, a sound business decision that had nothing to do with you. You chose to humiliate yourself by bringing your mistress to a family gathering and publicly announcing your infidelity. And as for the press coverage, I had nothing to do with its timing or focus. That said, I won't apologize for any of it. You've spent years undermining me professionally while betraying me personally. The fact that you're now facing consequences for your actions isn't my problem." "The board won't stand for this," he threatened. "A CEO who acquires a company where her husband works, then immediately creates a public relations nightmare? They'll remove you before you've even started." "The board unanimously approved my appointment," I reminded him, "including Gerald, who has witnessed your behavior for years and finds it concerning for very different reasons than you might imagine." "This isn't over," Marcus declared, echoing his words from the family reunion. "Actually, it is," I countered. "The acquisition is complete, the leadership transition is underway, and our marriage is ending. The only question remaining is whether you can adapt to this new reality in a way that allows you to remain at TriCore, or if you'd prefer to tender your resignation before tomorrow's board meeting." "You think I'd quit? Give you the satisfaction?" "I think you should make whatever decision best serves your career," I replied evenly. "If that means working under my leadership and proving your value to the company, I have no objection. If it means moving on to an organization where you can preserve the narrative of your executive genius, that's your choice." After a moment of tense silence, Marcus spoke again. His voice altered to a tone I recognized from countless negotiations. Reasonable, slightly conciliatory, but with an underlying calculation. "We should discuss this in person," he suggested. "Clear the air before tomorrow's meeting. Perhaps over dinner tonight?" The old Olivia might have agreed, seeking compromise even when none was warranted. That Olivia had gradually disappeared, over years of subtle undermining and not-so-subtle betrayal. "I don't think that would be productive," I replied. "I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." I ended the call before he could respond, then set my phone aside and moved to the hotel room window. Chicago's skyline stretched before me, the morning sun glinting off steel and glass towers housing countless corporate dramas not unlike my own. Somewhere in that landscape was the TriCore headquarters where tomorrow I would formally assume leadership. The path ahead was clear in some ways, profoundly complicated in others. Transforming TriCore would require focus, strategic vision, and an ability to manage complex interpersonal dynamics, including whatever approach Marcus ultimately chose to take. The divorce proceedings would create their own challenges, though. With Marcus's infidelity now publicly documented, my position was considerably strengthened. More importantly, I felt a sense of personal clarity that had been missing for years. The careful calculation and strategic patience that Marcus had dismissed as weakness had become my greatest strengths. While he had been performing the role of the dynamic executive destined for greatness, I had been quietly building something substantial, not just the acquisition of TriCore, but a foundation of self-reliance and clear-eyed assessment that would serve me long after our divorce was finalized. A knock at the hotel room door interrupted my thoughts. Opening it, I found a room service tray with breakfast and coffee I hadn't ordered, accompanied by a note in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. "Eat something substantial before conquering the corporate world. Call me when you've settled this business with Marcus and TriCore. The lake house is yours whenever you need escape. Love, Grandma P.S." Your grandfather would have been immensely proud, as am I. Smiling, I carried the tray to the small dining table by the window. As I poured coffee and organized my notes for the day ahead, I realized that for the first time in years I was looking forward to Monday morning with genuine anticipation rather than resigned determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many, I would face them as myself, no longer diminished by Marcus's calculated undermining or my own reluctance to claim the full measure of my capabilities. The company I had acquired was just the beginning. The self I was reclaiming was the true acquisition of value. Monday morning arrived with the peculiar clarity that often accompanies momentous days. I woke before my alarm, mind already cycling through preparations for the board meeting, press conference, and inevitable confrontation with Marcus. The financial news channels were buzzing with speculation about TriCore's future, with several analysts already upgrading their outlook based solely on the leadership change. TriCore's technological patents have been underutilized for years, one commentator declared as I dressed in the hotel room. If Olivia Winters brings the same strategic vision to TriCore that she demonstrated at Wellington Capital, shareholders can expect significant growth within 12 to 18 months. I selected my outfit with deliberate care, a tailored navy suit that projected authority without ostentation, paired with the simple pearl earrings my grandmother had given me upon my business school graduation. "For when you need to remind yourself of your worth," she had said, without announcing it to everyone else. The car service arrived precisely at 7:30 a.m., giving me time to review my presentations once more before reaching TriCore's headquarters. I had decided against bringing an entourage from Wellington. This transition needed to establish my individual authority rather than suggesting I required outside support. TriCore occupied a 12-story building in Chicago's business district, its glass facade emblazoned with the company's distinctive logo, a stylized T contained within a triangle. I had visited the building exactly once before for a holiday party during my first year of marriage to Marcus. Walking through the revolving doors now, as the company's new chief executive rather than an executive spouse, created a surreal sense of worlds colliding. The security guard at the reception desk did a double take as I approached. "Ms. Winters, we weren't expecting you until 9. "I prefer to arrive early my first day," I replied, accepting the visitor badge he hastily printed. "Is Gerald Harmon in yet?" "Yes, ma'am. Arrived about 20 minutes ago. He's in the executive conference room on 12. The elevator ride provided a brief moment of solitude to center myself. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I was greeted by Gerald's assistant, a composed woman in her 50s who showed no surprise at my early arrival. "Mr. Harmon is expecting you," she said, leading me down a corridor lined with framed patents and industry awards. "The board members have been arriving since 7. Everyone's quite eager to meet you before the formal session." Gerald rose. As I entered the conference room, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Olivia, welcome to TriCore. Officially this time." The 7 board members present greeted me with varying degrees of warmth, from the enthusiastic welcome of Diane Rodriguez, who had vocally supported my appointment, to the reserved acknowledgement of Howard Patel, who had initially argued for an external search process before ultimately voting in my favor. "I appreciate everyone adjusting their schedules for this meeting," I said, setting my materials on the table. "Given the accelerated timeline of our public announcement, I wanted to ensure we're aligned on messaging and immediate priorities." For the next 45 minutes, I outlined my initial assessment of TriCore's market position, identified areas for immediate investment, and presented a 100-day plan for operational restructuring. The board members engaged actively, asking pointed questions about everything from projected revenue growth to integration challenges. "What about the personnel situation?" Howard finally asked, delicately addressing the elephant in the room. "Specifically regarding your husband, who currently heads our commercial division." "Former husband," I corrected politely. "Divorce proceedings have been initiated. As for Marcus's position at TriCore, I propose treating it exactly as we would any executive role during a leadership transition. His performance and fit with our new strategic direction will determine his future with the company, without special consideration either way." Howard looked skeptical. "That sounds admirable in theory, but given the unusual circumstances, do you believe such neutrality is realistic?" "I believe professional judgment doesn't disappear in the face of personal complications," I replied. "That said, to address any concerns about conflict of interest, I suggest establishing an oversight process where any significant decisions regarding Marcus's role or department would include board review." This suggestion seemed to satisfy most concerns, though I noted Howard making additional notes as our discussion continued. At precisely 8:55 a.m., Gerald's assistant appeared at the door. "Mr. Winters has arrived for the 9 o'clock meeting," she announced, along with legal counsel. A murmur ran through the room. Marcus bringing an attorney to what was ostensibly an internal transition meeting represented a clear escalation. Gerald looked to me, silently offering to intervene. I shook my head slightly. "Please show them in," I said to the assistant. "We're ready." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly when Marcus entered, followed by a severe-looking man carrying a leather portfolio. Marcus had chosen his most imposing business attire, the custom-tailored charcoal suit he reserved for high-stakes negotiations, paired with the red tie he believed conveyed dominance. In another context, I might have found his theatrical approach to intimidation amusing. Today, it merely confirmed that he intended to make this process as difficult as possible. "Marcus," Gerald greeted him with deliberate neutrality. "And you've brought counsel. This is meant to be an internal business meeting." "Given the circumstances, I believed it prudent to have representation present," Marcus replied, his gaze fixed on me rather than Gerald. "Particularly since my wife has orchestrated a hostile takeover that directly impacts my position and career prospects." "Former wife," I corrected again, my tone professional. "And Winterfall's acquisition of TriCore was approved by the board and major shareholders through standard corporate governance processes. There was nothing hostile about it." The attorney beside Marcus cleared his throat. "If I may, my client has serious concerns about conflicts of interest and potential breaches of fiduciary duty surrounding this acquisition. We're prepared to file for injunctive relief if necessary." Gerald's expression hardened. "That would be an unfortunate waste of legal resources, considering our transaction has been vetted by 3 independent law firms and received unanimous board approval." As the tension in the room escalated, I made a quick decision. Perhaps we should address these concerns directly before proceeding with our regular agenda. "Marcus, if you'd like to articulate specific objections, we're prepared to listen." This approach seemed to momentarily throw him off balance. He had clearly anticipated resistance rather than accommodation. "My primary concern," he began, recovering quickly, "is that this acquisition represents a personal vendetta disguised as a business transaction. My wife, former wife," I interjected for the 3rd time, "has deliberately concealed her intentions, created a conflict of interest by acquiring her husband's employer, and is now positioning herself to either terminate my employment or make my position untenable through organizational restructuring." I maintained eye contact with Marcus as I responded. "The acquisition was evaluated on standard business metrics, including market positioning, patent portfolio strength, and growth potential. Your employment status played no role in that assessment. As for your future at TriCore, that will be determined by your performance and alignment with our strategic direction, exactly like every other executive." "That's disingenuous at best," Marcus countered. "You expect the board to believe personal considerations won't influence your decisions regarding my department and position?" "The board has already approved an oversight process specifically addressing potential conflicts," I replied. "Any significant decisions affecting your role will include board review. Does that address your concern?" Marcus exchanged glances with his attorney, clearly unprepared for this reasonable accommodation. "It's a start," he conceded reluctantly. "But I still object to the fundamental impropriety of this situation. The optics alone create significant reputational risk for TriCore." Diane Rodriguez, the most outspoken board member, leaned forward. "Mr. Winters, given that you chose to introduce your extramarital partner at a family gathering before any separation had been formalized, I'm not sure you're in the strongest position to lecture us about impropriety or reputational risk." Tense silence followed her blunt assessment. Marcus's attorney whispered something in his ear, likely advising him to moderate his approach given the unsympathetic audience. "My personal choices, however regrettable, Don't change the unusual nature of this corporate transition, Marcus finally said, his voice tightly controlled. I'm simply advocating for appropriate governance during this period. And we've established that, Gerald interjected. Now, unless you have specific business matters to address related to your division, we should proceed with our agenda. The press conference is scheduled for 11, and we have considerable ground to cover. For the next hour, the meeting progressed with superficial professionalism overlaying palpable tension. Marcus participated minimally, offering terse responses when directly questioned about commercial division operations. His attorney remained silent but watchful, occasionally making notes that seemed calculated to appear ominous. As the meeting concluded, Gerald announced the schedule for the rest of the day, including the press conference and an all-employee town hall at 2 o'clock. Olivia will be addressing the company as CEO for the first time, he explained. Division heads are expected to attend in person. Marcus nodded stiffly. I'll be there. As everyone gathered their materials, Marcus approached me directly for the first time. We need to talk privately, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. This situation is untenable. I'm booked solid until 4, I replied. Finley. My assistant can schedule you for 15 minutes at the end of the day if it's urgent. His expression darkened at being directed to my assistant, a procedural indignity he would never have tolerated from peers at his level. 15 minutes? That's all you'll grant me? That's all my schedule permits today, I corrected him. If you'd prefer to request a meeting later in the week, that's also an option. For a moment, I thought he might lose the tenuous hold on his temper. Instead, he nodded curtly. 4 o'clock then. But this conversation isn't over, Olivia. It never seems to be, I replied, gathering my materials and turning toward Gerald, who was waiting to escort me to the executive offices. The press conference at 11 proceeded largely as anticipated, with financial reporters focusing primarily on TriCore's strategic direction under new leadership. Gerald handled the initial introduction, describing the acquisition process in carefully neutral terms before presenting me as the new CEO. TriCore stands at a crucial inflection point, I stated once the initial flurry of camera flashes subsided. Our patent portfolio in renewable energy storage technologies positions us to become a market leader, but realizing that potential requires more aggressive development and commercialization strategies than we've previously pursued. Most questions focused on business matters, projected growth timelines, market positioning, and integration plans. Eventually, however, the personal dimension surfaced. Ms. Winters, how do you respond to speculation that this acquisition was motivated by personal factors, given your husband's position at TriCore? Asked a reporter from Bloomberg. Former husband, I corrected, maintaining the same professional tone I'd used all morning. Any significant acquisition decision is evaluated on business fundamentals, market positioning, growth potential, and shareholder value. TriCore met all our investment criteria independently of any personal connections. That said, we've implemented additional governance measures to address any potential conflicts of interest during this transition. Will Marcus Winters remain with the company? Another reporter called out. TriCore values all our talented executives, I replied diplomatically. Individual personnel matters aren't appropriate topics for public discussion. After the press conference, Gerald guided me through a rapid series of introductory meetings with TriCore's executive leadership team. Most received me with cautious professionalism, clearly reserving judgment until they could better assess my leadership style and priorities. The Chief Financial Officer, Janet Chen, was particularly forthcoming. "I've been advocating for more aggressive investment in our energy storage patents for 3 years," she told me during our one-on-one session. The previous leadership approach was too conservative, focusing on incremental improvements to existing product lines rather than developing our next-generation technologies. "That aligns with my assessment," I acknowledged. "What's been the primary resistance point?" Janet hesitated momentarily. "Honestly, Marcus. He controls the commercial relationships with our largest customers, and he's consistently argued against any strategy that might disrupt those relationships or require significant reinvestment of current profits." This information wasn't entirely surprising. Marcus had always favored strategies that produced immediate, measurable results over longer-term investments with less certain outcomes. It was part of what had made him successful in sales-oriented roles throughout his career. However, it also revealed a potential obstacle to implementing the strategic vision that had made TriCore an attractive acquisition target in the first place. "Thank you for your candor," I told Janet. "I'd like to review the investment proposals you've developed previously. They might provide a useful starting point for our go-forward strategy." By the time the all-employee town hall arrived at 2:00, I had developed a clearer understanding of TriCore's internal dynamics and the challenges ahead. The company's auditorium was filled to capacity, with hundreds of employees gathered to meet their new CEO, while hundreds more watched via video conference from regional offices. Gerald introduced me with the same business-like efficiency he'd demonstrated at the press conference, emphasizing my track record at Wellington and vision for TriCore's future. As I took the podium, I surveyed the sea of faces before me. People whose livelihoods would be affected by my decisions in the coming months and years. The responsibility was sobering. "Change creates uncertainty," I began, acknowledging the elephant in the room. "And leadership transitions naturally raise questions about direction, priorities, and individual roles. I'm not here to dismantle what works at TriCore, but to accelerate our progress in areas where we have untapped potential." For the next 20 minutes, I outlined my initial assessment of TriCore's strengths and opportunities, emphasizing the renewable energy storage technologies that represented our greatest growth potential. I described a future where TriCore led the industry rather than followed it, where innovation was valued alongside stability, and where employees at all levels could contribute to a shared vision of excellence. Throughout my presentation, I was acutely aware of Marcus seated in the front row, his expression carefully neutral but his body language radiating tension. When I opened the floor for questions, he remained silent, allowing others to ask about everything from specific technology investments to potential organizational changes. A software engineer near the back finally asked the question many were likely wondering: will there be layoffs as part of this transition? Major organizational changes are not my immediate priority, I answered honestly. Before making any significant structural decisions, I need to develop a deeper understanding of our operations and talent. That said, as we shift resources toward high-growth areas, some roles may evolve or be redefined. My commitment is to communicate openly throughout that process. As the town hall concluded, employees approached me individually, introducing themselves and sharing brief perspectives on their departments. Marcus remained seated, watching these interactions with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, somewhere between calculation and resignation. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, facility tours, and introductions. By the time 4 o'clock approached, I was mentally cataloging dozens of observations and insights that would shape my first critical decisions as CEO. When my assistant reminded me of my scheduled meeting with Marcus, I briefly considered rescheduling, then decided that postponing the inevitable confrontation served no purpose. Marcus arrived precisely at 4, now without his attorney but carrying a thin folder. My new office, formerly Gerald's before he transitioned to chairman, felt both unfamiliar and strangely right, its panoramic windows overlooking the Chicago skyline I'd admired from my hotel room that morning. "Thank you for making time," Marcus began, his tone formally professional. "I know your first day has been demanding." "What did you want to discuss?" I asked, bypassing the small talk neither of us was interested in. He placed the folder on my desk. "My resignation, effective immediately." This was not what I had anticipated. "That's certainly your prerogative," I said carefully. Though I meant what I said about evaluating your position based on performance rather than personal history. "Let's not pretend the situation is workable," Marcus replied, a hint of his earlier anger bleeding through the professional veneer. "You've won, Olivia. You've acquired the company, taken the position I've worked toward for years, and demonstrated to everyone in our professional and personal circles that you've outmaneuvered me completely. Continuing to work here would only compound the humiliation." His framing was revealing, casting the situation as a zero-sum game where my success necessarily constituted his defeat. It was the same worldview that had gradually poisoned our marriage, transforming what should have been a partnership into a competition neither of us could truly win. "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about building something valuable. Your commercial expertise could be an asset to TriCore moving forward, despite our personal history." Marcus laughed without humor. "Now who's being disingenuous? We both know you'll dismantle my commercial strategy within months. Janet Chen didn't waste any time sharing her investment proposals with you, did she?" I didn't bother denying it. Different leadership naturally brings different priorities. That's business, not personal. "It became personal the moment you decided to acquire this specific company." He gestured around the office. "You could have purchased any undervalued manufacturer with promising technology. You chose the one where I had built my career and reputation. TriCore's renewable energy storage patents made it uniquely attractive compared to alternatives," I countered. "But I understand why you might see it differently." Marcus studied me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You know what's extraordinary? I never saw this coming. All those years I thought I understood exactly who you were. Competent but cautious, smart but not strategic. I completely underestimated you." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did." He nodded slowly, absorbing this confirmation. "For what it's worth, I didn't plan to announce things the way I did at your grandmother's. Sophia insisted we stop hiding our relationship. I thought a family setting would be less humiliating for you than a public one." The explanation was so perfectly in character, justifying cruelty as consideration, that I nearly laughed. "Thank you for that thoughtfulness," I said, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. "I'm sure it had nothing to do with your certainty that I wouldn't create a scene in front of my family." "You never do create scenes," he observed. "Until yesterday, I considered that a weakness. I see now it was simply patience." His insight, however belated, struck closer to truth than I had expected. My tendency toward careful assessment and strategic patience, traits Marcus had often dismissed as indecisiveness or lack of boldness, had ultimately served me far better. then his preference for dramatic gestures and immediate gratification. "I'll process your resignation through HR," I said, returning to practical matters. "Your severance will follow the standard executive package outlined in your contract." Marcus rose to leave, then hesitated. "What happened with Sophia?" "It wasn't just physical attraction. She understood my ambitions, supported them without question. With you, I always felt I was justifying my choices, defending my approach." "That wasn't support, Marcus. That was absence of challenge. I questioned your decisions because I saw their flaws, not because I didn't believe in your capabilities." He absorbed this with a slight nod. "Maybe. Either way, she's gone now too." Apparently, dating a man who's been publicly outmaneuvered by his wife doesn't align with her career aspirations. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Marcus had constructed his entire identity around a particular vision of success, one that required constant validation and the appearance of mastery. Losing that facade had clearly shaken him profoundly. "For what it's worth," I said as he reached the door, "I think you're making the right decision. Not because you couldn't contribute value to TriCore, but because you need to build something that's entirely yours, not defined by our history." He paused without turning. "That's surprisingly generous, given everything." "It's not generosity. It's pragmatism. We both deserve fresh starts." After Marcus left, I remained at my desk, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city skyline. His resignation simplified certain aspects of the transition while creating new challenges. His commercial relationships would need to be managed carefully to prevent customer anxiety during the leadership change. My assistant knocked lightly, before entering with a stack of messages and meeting requests that had accumulated throughout the day. Among them was a handwritten note from Gerald. "Olivia, exceptional handling of a complex first day. The board is unanimously impressed with your composure and strategic clarity. Dinner this evening to discuss next steps? My club at 7 Gerald Sack." I confirmed the dinner invitation and continued working through the messages, making notes for follow-up items and prioritizing meetings for the coming days. The enormity of what I had undertaken, not just acquiring a company but assuming direct responsibility for its transformation and the livelihoods of hundreds of employees, settled over me with both weight and excitement. A text message from my grandmother provided unexpected perspective. "Your grandfather built his first company from nothing after losing everything in the '87 crash. He always said the measure of success isn't what you acquire, but what you build. I suspect you're about to do both. Dinner Sunday? I want to hear everything." As the day's last light faded from my office window, I found myself thinking not about Marcus or the dramatic events of the past few days, but about the path ahead. The acquisition had been merely the first step. The true challenge and opportunity lay in transforming TriCore into the industry leader it should be, leveraging its technological innovations and repositioning it for sustainable growth. Marcus had been right about one thing. I could have chosen any undervalued manufacturer with promising technology. I had chosen TriCore not just because of its specific advantages, but because its potential resonated with me in a way that transcended business metrics. Perhaps that connection had developed through years of hearing Marcus discuss the company's technologies, or perhaps it reflected some deeper alignment between my vision and the company's capabilities. Either way, TriCore was now mine to shape, without the constraints of Marcus's more cautious commercial approach or the need to moderate my strategic instincts to accommodate his ego. The freedom was exhilarating, and the responsibility sobering. As I gathered my things to meet Gerald for dinner, I paused at the office window for one final look at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in that urban landscape was the hotel where I'd spent last night contemplating this very moment. So much had changed in the span of 24 hours, yet the clarity I'd felt then had only strengthened with each passing hour. The careful calculation and strategic patience that Marcus had dismissed as weaknesses had proven to be my greatest strengths. While he had been performing the role of the dynamic executive destined for greatness, I had been quietly building something substantial. Not just the acquisition of a company, but the foundation for a future defined by my own vision rather than someone else's limitations. The path ahead would undoubtedly bring challenges I couldn't yet anticipate, but for the first time in years, I felt perfectly equipped to meet them. Not as Marcus Winter's wife or former wife, but simply as myself, finally operating at full capacity without artificial constraints. And that realization was worth more than any acquisition. 1 year after acquiring TriCore Industries, I stood at the podium of the Chicago Economic Club's annual leadership conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience of 500 executives, investors, and business journalists represented the elite of the Midwest's corporate community. Among them sat Gerald Harmon, now enjoying his official retirement, and Janet Chen, whom I'd promoted to Chief Operating Officer within my first month as CEO. The digital display behind me showed TriCore's new logo, the traditional triangle, now interconnected with flowing lines representing energy transfer. A visual embodiment of the company's transformation under my leadership. Growth isn't just measured in quarterly earnings or stock price, I began, meeting the gaze of audience members in the front rows. True growth transforms not just balance sheets, but possibilities. It expands what we believe achievable and redefines the boundaries of potential. As I continued my address, outlining TriCore's journey from solid mid-market performer to industry innovator, I reflected on my own parallel transformation, from someone who carefully managed others' perceptions to a leader who unapologetically shaped reality according to her own vision. The 12 months since that dramatic family reunion had unfolded with a momentum that surprised even me. TriCore's stock price had increased 87% since my first day as CEO, driven primarily by 3 critical strategic shifts I'd implemented within my first 100 days. First, we had aggressively invested in commercializing our renewable energy storage patents, moving from theoretical research to market-ready products faster than analysts had believed possible. Second, we'd restructured our manufacturing operations to prioritize flexibility and innovation over traditional economies of scale. And third, we'd acquired 2 smaller technology firms whose complementary innovations had accelerated our development timeline by nearly 18 months. Traditional wisdom suggests transformation requires disruption, I continued, advancing to a slide showing TriCore's organizational evolution. And certainly, change creates necessary discomfort. But the most sustainable transformations don't destroy existing foundations. They build upon them while simultaneously reimagining what those foundations can support. In the audience, I spotted the business editor from the Wall Street Journal, who had authored a particularly insightful profile of my leadership approach 3 months earlier. Her article titled "The Patience Advantage: How Olivia Winters Transformed TriCore Through Strategic Restraint" had highlighted how my tendency toward careful assessment and deliberate action, qualities Marcus had often dismissed as indecisiveness, had enabled more fundamental change than a more impulsive approach might have achieved. At TriCore, we discovered that our greatest asset wasn't any particular technology or patent, but rather the untapped capacity of our people when aligned around a compelling vision, I explained. 87% of our current executive team was already within the organization when I arrived. They didn't need replacing, they needed clarity, purpose, and the authority to pursue excellence without artificial constraints. What I didn't say explicitly was how many of those executives had flourished once freed from Marcus's particular leadership style, which had rewarded loyalty and agreement over innovation and constructive challenge. After his abrupt resignation, I'd discovered entire departments operating well below their capabilities, staffed by talented individuals who had learned to minimize risk rather than maximize potential. True leadership isn't about having all the answers, I continued, advancing. To my next point, it's about asking better questions and creating environments where truth can surface without fear. In many organizations, the solutions to critical challenges already exist within the collective knowledge of the team. They simply haven't been invited to emerge. As I concluded my formal remarks and moved into the Q&A session, I felt a familiar sense of centered confidence. The woman who had once carefully modulated her intelligence and ambition to accommodate her husband's ego now addressed a room full of industry leaders with straightforward authority, neither apologizing for her success nor feeling compelled to exaggerate it. Ms. Winters, called out the CEO of a regional energy utility, TriCore's battery storage technology has outpaced market expectations significantly. What challenges do you foresee in maintaining that innovation advantage over the next 3 to 5 years? The question allowed me to highlight our R&D investments and talent development programs, areas where I'd redirected resources that Marcus had previously allocated to maintaining existing customer relationships. Those relationships remained important, but under my leadership, TriCore had shifted from a customer retention focus to a customer expansion strategy, helping existing clients reimagine their own possibilities through our technological innovations. As the session concluded with enthusiastic applause, I was approached by a steady stream of executives interested in exploring partnerships or simply connecting with the woman responsible for one of Chicago's most dramatic corporate turnarounds. Among them was Alexandra Mercer, CEO of Meridian Energy, who had recently been featured in Fortune's Most Powerful Women in Business issue. "That was refreshingly substance-focused," she commented as we exchanged business cards. "Too many of these keynotes are exercises in self-promotion rather than actual insight." "I find audiences respond to authenticity," I replied, "especially when backed by measurable results." "Indeed." She studied me with open interest. "I've followed TriCore's transformation with professional curiosity. Your approach to integrating those technology acquisitions was particularly impressive, maintaining the innovative culture while aligning them with your broader strategy. We should have dinner sometime. Compare notes on leading through transition." I accepted her invitation with genuine interest. In the year since assuming TriCore's leadership, I'd gradually expanded my professional network to include other CEOs, particularly women leading technical organizations. These relationships had provided valuable perspective during challenging decisions, offering insights from those who understood the unique pressures of the position. As the event transitioned to cocktails and networking, Gerald approached, champagne, flutes in hand. "Magnificent presentation," he said, offering me a glass. "Though I notice you didn't mention your ex-husband once, despite his rather dramatic contribution to your origin story." I smiled at his characteristic directness. "Marcus belonged in last year's narrative, not this year's. Besides, success is the best response to underestimation." "Well said." Gerald clinked his glass against mine. Have you heard from him recently? Only through attorneys finalizing the last details of our property settlement. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, with surprisingly little conflict once Marcus accepted the reality of our situation. He had moved to Boston to join a management consulting firm, a career shift that allowed him to leverage his experience while creating distance from the Chicago business community, where my success at TriCore had become a frequent topic of conversation. And personally? Gerald asked with the privilege of a mentor who had become something of a friend. Any developments worth mentioning? I understood the question behind his question. At 68, Gerald had appointed himself unofficial matchmaker to what he considered promising executives, believing that balanced personal lives created more effective business leaders. I've been somewhat occupied transforming a company, I replied dryly. Though I did finally take my grandmother's suggestion to join the Chicago Symphony's Young Patrons Board, the networking has been unexpectedly valuable. Cultural pursuits are essential, Gerald approved, though perhaps insufficient as a complete life strategy. Before I could formulate a suitably diplomatic response, we were interrupted by Janet Chen, who approached with barely contained excitement. The Peterson Group just called, she announced without preamble. They're accepting our proposal for the joint venture. Full terms, no further negotiation required. This was significant news. We'd been courting Peterson, a leader in commercial-scale solar installations, for months. Their acceptance of our proposed partnership structure represented a major validation of our technological approach and would accelerate our market penetration significantly. That's excellent, I replied, already mentally adjusting next quarter's projections. Did they explain the timing? We weren't expecting a decision until next week. Apparently, McKinley Energy approached them with a competing offer yesterday, Janet explained. They conducted a final technical evaluation of both proposals and determined our solution offered superior performance metrics. They're announcing at market open tomorrow and wanted us prepared. Gerald excused himself to allow us to discuss implications, and for the next 15 minutes, Janet and I strategized our response to this unexpected acceleration. As TriCore's COO, she had become my most trusted executive partner, combining technical expertise with pragmatic business instincts. Our working relationship had developed an almost telepathic quality, each of us anticipating the other's questions and concerns. We should alert the manufacturing team tonight, Janet concluded as we finished our tactical planning. They'll need to adjust production scheduling immediately. Agreed. And let's schedule a call with Robinson for first thing tomorrow to discuss supply chain implications. James Robinson, our chief supply officer, had been orchestrating a just-in-time inventory system that would need recalibration based on the new production timeline. As Janet departed to make the necessary arrangements, I found myself approached by a young woman I didn't immediately recognize. Ms. Winters? I'm Zoe Taylor from the University of Chicago School of Business. I'm researching women's leadership trajectories for my doctoral dissertation, and I wondered if you might consider an interview. Something in her earnest determination reminded me of myself 15 years earlier. Ambitious but still uncertain of her path, hungry for models of what might be possible. Send me a proposal, I suggested, offering her my card. I can't promise anything, but I'll consider it. Her face lit up with surprised delight. Thank you, I will. And may I just say that your keynote was genuinely inspiring. The way you've transformed TriCore while maintaining your authentic leadership style. It's exactly the kind of case study that needs more visibility. After she departed, I found myself reflecting on her words. Authentic leadership style wasn't a phrase I would have associated with myself during my marriage to Marcus. For years, I had carefully modulated my approach to accommodate his ego, concealing my full capabilities beneath a veneer of supportiveness. The freedom to lead without that constraint had been perhaps the most unexpected gift of the past year. The discovery that my natural tendencies toward strategic patience and careful analysis could create more substantial transformation than Marcus's preference for bold declarations and dramatic gestures. As the event concluded, I checked my phone to find a message from my grandmother. Saw your company made the Fortune Most Innovative list. Not surprised, but delighted. Dinner. Sunday. The lake house has missed you. I smiled at her characteristic blend of pride and gentle admonishment. Despite TriCore's demands, I had maintained our Sunday dinner tradition whenever possible, finding unexpected restoration in those evenings away from corporate responsibilities. At 87, my grandmother remained my most clear-eyed advisor, offering perspective untainted by organizational politics or market pressures. The car service collected me from the hotel entrance, the driver already familiar with my preference for quiet during the ride home. As Chicago's evening skyline glittered, outside the window, I found myself taking stock not just of TriCore's transformation, but of my own. The woman who had once believed herself complete only within the context of a partnership now recognized her independent wholeness. The executive who had once carefully concealed her full capabilities now leveraged them without apology. The strategist, who had once channeled her insights through others, now shaped reality directly according to her own vision. None of these changes had come without cost. The dissolution of a decade-long marriage, however flawed, had created genuine grief alongside liberation. The responsibility for hundreds of employees' livelihoods carried weight that occasionally manifested as 3 a.m. anxiety. The public scrutiny that accompanied corporate success created pressure that required deliberate management. Yet these challenges seemed proportionate to the growth they enabled, necessary resistance that strengthened rather than diminished. Each difficult decision, each strategic risk, each public commitment had further integrated the person I had always been beneath the adaptive camouflage of my marriage. The car turned onto my street, approaching the renovated brownstone I'd purchased 6 months earlier. Unlike the suburban home I'd shared with Marcus, with its carefully neutral aesthetic designed to support his professional image, this space reflected my actual preferences. Clean architectural lines softened by unexpected artistic elements, historical details preserved alongside modern functionality. It was neither a rejection of the past nor a shrine to it, but rather an integration of valuable elements into something wholly new, much like TriCore itself, much like me. As I entered my home, setting keys and bag on the entryway table, my phone chimed with an incoming email from Alexandra Mercer, following up on our conversation with a dinner invitation for the following week. The subject line read, "Women Transforming Industries, Continuing the Conversation." I confirmed the invitation before preparing for bed, reviewing the next day's schedule with particular attention to the Peterson announcement implications. My early morning would begin with calls to key investors, followed by a press briefing and emergency production meeting. The pace would be demanding but energizing, exactly the kind of high-stakes execution that had previously remained theoretical during my Wellington Capital days. As I settled into bed with a final review of quarterly projections, I reflected on the extraordinary distance traveled since that family reunion where Marcus had introduced Sophia as his upgrade. Had anyone suggested then that his public betrayal would ultimately catalyze my professional and personal renaissance? I would have dismissed the idea as hollow consolation. Yet here I was, leading a company through transformative growth, building a life aligned with my authentic values, and discovering capabilities I had previously subordinated to the requirements of an unbalanced partnership. The next morning dawned, with the particular energy that accompanies significant announcements. The Peterson joint venture represented not just a business milestone for TriCore, but validation of the strategic vision I had championed against considerable skepticism from certain board members and market analysts. My executive team gathered in the conference room adjacent to my office, each member bringing updates from their respective departments. The atmosphere held the focused intensity I had deliberately cultivated at TriCore, collaborative rather than competitive, challenging rather than combative. Peterson's technical team is requesting an integration timeline, reported our chief technology officer, David Faulkner. They're prepared to embed personnel with our development team as early as next week. That's significantly ahead of schedule, Janet observed. Can we accommodate without disrupting the Westlake client deployment? With adjustments, yes, David confirmed. I've identified 3 senior engineers who can transition immediately without creating critical gaps elsewhere. The conversation continued in this vein, practical, solution-oriented, focused on execution rather than attribution. I had worked deliberately to create this culture, systematically dismantling the territorial dynamics that had flourished under Marcus's leadership, where departments competed for recognition and resources rather than collaborating toward shared objectives. Before we conclude, I announced as the meeting drew to a close, I want to acknowledge something important about this moment. The Peterson partnership isn't just a business milestone. It's validation of a vision many considered overambitious. When we began this journey together, each of you contributed to making the seemingly impossible not just possible but inevitable. That's the standard of excellence we're establishing at TriCore. As the team dispersed to their respective responsibilities, Janet remained behind. The Peterson technical lead mentioned something interesting during our call, she said. Apparently, McKinley's proposal included Marcus as their strategic advisor. He was personally involved in their pitch. This was the first I'd heard of Marcus's involvement with our competitor. His non-compete agreement had expired 3 months earlier, making such a role legally permissible. But the timing suggested deliberate positioning against TriCore's interests. Interesting, I replied, careful to maintain neutral tone. Did they indicate his involvement influenced their decision process? Only indirectly. The lead engineer mentioned that McKinley's approach seemed conventionally conservative, despite their innovative reputation. Reading between the lines, I suspect Marcus advised a strategy similar to what he would have implemented here. Emphasis on established commercial relationships rather than technological differentiation. I nodded, unsurprised. Marcus had always prioritized relationship management over technical innovation, an approach that had maintained TriCore's market position while underutilizing its potential. That same strategy, applied to a competitor with less substantial technological advantages, would indeed appear conventionally conservative. We won on technical merit, Janet concluded. Peterson's engineers were emphatic about that. But I thought, you should know about Marcus's involvement. I appreciate the information, I said, though it doesn't change our path forward. After Janet departed, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Marcus advising our competitor represented a kind of closure, confirmation that our professional lives had truly diverged into separate trajectories. Where once we had been partners, then adversaries within the same organization, now we operated in genuinely separate spheres, each pursuing our distinct visions of success. The press briefing regarding the Peterson partnership proceeded exactly as planned, with financial analysts responding enthusiastically to the growth implications. TriCore's stock price jumped 7% within the first hour of trading, reflecting market confidence in our strategic direction. The manufacturing team rapidly adapted production schedules to accommodate accelerated timelines, demonstrating the organizational flexibility I had deliberately cultivated. By early afternoon, I had completed a series of investor calls and was reviewing design specifications for the integrated storage solution we would develop with Peterson when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Sophia Chen is here," she stated, clearly uncertain about how to handle this particular situation. "She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent about speaking with you personally." This was genuinely surprising. I hadn't seen or communicated with Sophia since the family reunion a year earlier, and could imagine no professional reason for her to seek me out now. "Give me 2 minutes, then show her in," I instructed, quickly closing confidential materials on my computer and mentally shifting gears. When Sophia entered my office, she appeared markedly different from the confident woman who had stood beside Marcus at the reunion. Her posture held tension, her expression a mixture of determination and discomfort. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she began, declining my gesture toward a chair. "I won't take much of your time." "What can I do for you, Ms. Chen?" I kept my tone professionally neutral, genuinely curious about her purpose. "I've accepted a position with Adaptive Systems in their marketing department," she stated. "They're a TriCore vendor, so I wanted to address any potential concerns directly before beginning next month. Adaptive Systems supplied specialized components for our storage units, not a major vendor, but significant enough that her employment there raised legitimate conflict of interest questions given her history with Marcus and TriCore." "I appreciate your transparency," I replied. "Have you disclosed your previous relationship with TriCore's former commercial director to Adaptive?" "Fully," she confirmed. "And I've signed enhanced confidentiality agreements specifically excluding me from any TriCore account activities." I studied her with genuine curiosity. This level of professional precaution suggested lessons learned from her experience with Marcus, perhaps painfully. "That seems appropriately cautious," I acknowledged. "Provided those boundaries remain clear, I don't anticipate objections from our procurement team." Relief visibly relaxed her posture. "Thank you, I wasn't certain you would be reasonable about this, given our history." "Our history is minimal, Ms. Chen," I corrected gently. "We've met exactly once, under circumstances neither of us would likely choose to repeat." She nodded, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "That's fair, and more generous than I probably deserve." Something in her expression, a mixture of regret and resignation, prompted unexpected empathy. Whatever her role in Marcus's betrayal, she had clearly experienced her own consequences from those choices. "If I may ask," I said, "why Adaptive Systems? With your background, larger marketing opportunities would seem available." Sophia hesitated before answering. "After what happened with Marcus and TriCore, certain doors closed. The Chicago business community is smaller than it appears, and stories travel. Adaptive represents a fresh start in a slightly different sector." I understood the subtext immediately. Sophia had discovered the professional consequences of being Perceived as someone who had participated in a senior executive's marital implosion that led to corporate disruption. Right or wrong, such perceptions created reputational challenges that followed one's resume. Reputation recovery requires time and consistent demonstration of value, I observed. But it's entirely possible, particularly when approached with transparency, as you're doing now. She studied me with newfound consideration. You're not what I expected. People rarely are, when we look beyond our assumptions to see them clearly. After Sophia departed, I returned to the Peterson integration plans with renewed focus. The unexpected conversation had provided a curious bookend to the Marcus chapter of my professional and personal life. With the divorce finalized, TriCore thriving under new leadership, and now even Sophia moving toward her own fresh start, the circumstances that had once seemed so painfully defining had transformed into mere background context for the life and company I was building. That evening, as I prepared for a board dinner to celebrate the Peterson announcement, I received an unexpected email from Zoe Taylor, the doctoral student I'd met at the economic club event. Rather than the interview proposal I'd expected, she'd sent a draft article titled Strategic Patience, the Undervalued Leadership Advantage, citing TriCore's transformation as her central case study. Her analysis was surprisingly insightful, identifying how traits often dismissed as female hesitation, careful assessment, inclusive decision processes, and long-term orientation had enabled more substantial organizational transformation than traditionally celebrated bold leadership approaches typically associated with male executives. In rejecting the false dichotomy between decisive action and thoughtful consideration, she wrote, Olivia Winters has demonstrated that the most effective leaders integrate both capabilities, knowing when to move swiftly and when to allow solutions to emerge through deliberate examination of complex factors. As I finished reading, my phone lit up with a text from my grandmother. Lake House this weekend, no excuses. You need perspective that doesn't come with stock tickers attached. Bring that strategic patience the business journals keep mentioning. We'll apply it to fishing. I smiled, typing back my acceptance. The path ahead held challenges I couldn't yet anticipate. TriCore's continued transformation, new competitive dynamics, and my own evolution as a leader. Yet, the foundation beneath these challenges had been transformed completely from the uncertain ground I'd stood upon a year earlier at that fateful family reunion, where once I had carefully managed my capabilities to accommodate someone else's ego. I now deployed them fully in service of a vision larger than myself. Where I had once concealed my ambitions beneath a veneer of supportiveness, I now pursued them openly, bringing others along through authentic leadership rather than performative modesty. The woman Marcus had underestimated, the woman I had sometimes underestimated myself, had emerged not just intact but enlarged by the very challenges designed to diminish her. That transformation represented the most valuable acquisition of all. As I prepared to join the board for dinner, I paused at my office window, taking in the Chicago skyline now illuminated against the evening sky. Somewhere in that urban landscape was the family home where Marcus had introduced Sophia as his upgrade, inadvertently setting in motion the series of events that had led to this moment. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, nor was the profound irony of his role in catalyzing my professional and personal renaissance. In attempting to diminish me, he had inadvertently freed me to become fully myself. In seeking an upgrade to a partner who wouldn't challenge his self-image, he had ultimately elevated me to a position where my capabilities could flourish without constraint. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it had led to destinations I might otherwise never have discovered. And that realization, perhaps, was the most empowering legacy of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.